Imagine a man who once loved, but a man who was shattered by the very thing he loved. The pain he carried was so great that, instead of enduring it, he tore out his own heart and locked it inside a chest. A cursed sailor who made deals with death, the master of the Kraken, the captain of the Flying Dutchman, the feared ruler of the seas. Davy Jones's story was not the story of a monster. It was the story of a man in love and how he was swallowed by darkness along with his pain. Davy Jones was not always like this. At the beginning, he too was mortal. He was a great sailor who lived by the sea, knew the sea, and built his life upon it. And what changed his life was neither war, nor gold, nor the desire for power. It all began with Calypso. Calypso was no ordinary being. She was a divine entity connected to the sea. Davy Jones fell in love with her. This was not some passing feeling. It was a bond strong enough to change the course of his life. Then Calypso gave him a great duty to gather the souls of those who died at sea and carry them to the other world. For this duty, she gave him the Flying Dutchman. And so Davy Jones was no longer just an ordinary captain. He became a servant moving between the living and the dead. The terms were clear. Davy Jones would carry out this duty for 10 years. At the end of those 10 years, he would be allowed to step onto land and reunite with Calypso. That was his reward. For 10 years, he would live side by side with death. But in the end, he would be reunited with the one he loved. And Jones accepted, because sometimes, to reach the one you love, a person will accept anything. For years, he fulfilled his duty. He carried the souls of those who died at sea. As the captain of the Flying Dutchman, he sailed through dark waters. But through all that time, the only thing keeping him going was the thought that one day he would be with Calypso again. At last, that day came. Davy Jones stepped onto land. He waited, but Calypso never came. That was the moment everything changed. Davy Jones did not see it as a simple delay. He saw it as betrayal. The one he had given years of his life for had not come. The one he had waited for, believed in, and loved had left him alone. From that moment on, the love inside him began to rot. It gave way to heartbreak. Heartbreak turned into anger. And in the end, Davy Jones no longer wanted to go on living with that pain. He tore his own heart from his chest. He placed it inside a chest, and he locked it away. That chest would come to be known as the dead man's chest. The reason he placed his heart there was simple. He no longer wanted to feel anything. Not pain, not longing, not even love. But what he did not save him. After separating his heart from his body, he did not become more peaceful. On the contrary, he became colder, harsher, and far more ruthless. That was where the real breaking point began, because Davy Jones did not just lose his heart, he lost his direction as well. Before long, that anger pushed him even further. When the Brethren Court searched for a way to stop Calypso, the one who helped them was Davy Jones. He was the one who knew her best. He was the one who knew how she could be deceived. And in the end, he played a role in Calypso's imprisonment. The most painful part was this: he had been betrayed by her, and yet he still could not fully let her go. So what destroyed Davy Jones's life was not betrayal alone. It was the fact that he could never forget that betrayal. After Calypso, not only his soul, but even his duty became corrupted. As the captain of the Flying Dutchman, his true task was to carry the souls of the dead. But over time, Jones drifted away from that duty. Instead of guiding souls, he became a captain who spread fear across the seas. And that came with a price. Both Davy Jones and his crew were cursed. As time passed, their bodies began to change. They slowly lost their human appearance. Davy Jones's face twisted into a horrifying form, resembling sea creatures, and his crew changed in the same way. They were no longer ordinary sailors, but creatures burdened by a long and terrible curse. From that point on, Davy Jones became a legend upon the seas. The Flying Dutchman was under his command. The Kraken was his greatest weapon, and to cross paths with him at sea was, for most people, the beginning of the end. He became especially known for the bargains he offered to sailors on the verge of death. He gave a choice. They could die at once or serve aboard the Flying Dutchman for 100 years. At first glance, this offer looked like salvation, but in truth, it was nothing more than death delayed, because those who stepped onto that ship slowly lost themselves over time. One of the clearest examples of this was Bootstrap Bill Turner. He had once been an ordinary sailor and a father, but the years he spent aboard the Flying Dutchman changed him little by little. His body deteriorated, his will grew weak, his past began to slip away from him. What became of him clearly showed how dark the order Davy Jones created truly was. It was at this point that Will Turner entered the story, because this was no longer just about stopping a dangerous captain roaming the seas. For Will, it was also about saving his father. Another important figure who crossed Davy Jones's path was Jack Sparrow. Jack had made a deal with Jones before, but when the time came to pay, he tried to run from it. Davy Jones, however, was never a man who made exceptions when it came to bargains. So he went after Jack. He marked him, and then he unleashed the Kraken. And so the name of Davy Jones began to echo once more, not only in fearful legends, but at the very center of unfolding events. But as great as Davy Jones's power was, his greatest weakness was just as great, because his heart was no longer in his chest. It was hidden inside the dead man's chest. And whoever possessed that heart held, in a way, power over Davy Jones himself. That truth led to one of the most important turning points in the story. Lord Cutler Beckett gained possession of Jones's heart, and with it, he began using Davy Jones for his own interests. The man who had ruled over others at sea for years was now forced to serve another power. This was one of the most humiliating periods of his life, because now he was no longer acting only through his own anger, but under Beckett's orders as well. During this time, the pressure on the pirates increased. The seas became even more dangerous, and at one point, the Kraken was killed as well. The end of the Kraken showed that Davy Jones's power was beginning to weaken, because that creature had been one of the greatest pillars of the reign of fear he had built across the seas. He was still extremely dangerous, but he no longer seemed as untouchable as before. And through all of this, the matter of Calypso had never truly ended. Years had passed, and Davy Jones had become someone else entirely. Yet the old wound inside him remained exactly where it was. When he met Calypso again, that became painfully clear, because it was never only about anger. Davy Jones had betrayed her. He had handed her over. He had built his life upon hatred, and yet he still could not fully let her go. That is why Davy Jones is not an ordinary villain. What makes him powerful is not only his appearance or the fear he inspires, but the conflict inside him. On one hand, he had become cruel. On the other, he could never escape the shadow of his own past. In the end, every road led to the final reckoning. The Black Pearl and the Flying Dutchman stood against one another. On one side was Jack Sparrow, on the other, Will Turner, and before them stood Davy Jones, the man who had spread terror across the seas for years. During the battle, Jones was still a deadly opponent, but this time, his weakness was known. The only way to stop him was to reach his heart. In the middle of the conflict, Will Turner was gravely wounded. It seemed as though everything had been lost, but the struggle was not over, because the only thing that could bring Davy Jones's story to an end was the very heart he had placed inside that chest years ago. And that heart had fallen into the hands of Will Turner, who wanted to save his father. In the end, that heart was stabbed, and so Davy Jones met his end. He had tried to escape his pain by separating his heart from his body, but years later, that same heart became the cause of his death. And that was the most tragic part of Davy Jones's story. The very thing he had tried to flee from became his fate in the end. The final name to leave his lips was Calypso, and that alone said so much, because from the very beginning, the same things had always been at the center of Davy Jones's life: love, betrayal, and the collapse that followed. When we look at Davy Jones's life from beginning to end, what we see is not merely a terrifying sea creature. What we see is a man who slowly fell apart after a devastating fracture. He had once been someone who loved, who waited, and who believed. Then what he lived through changed him. First, he lost his heart, then his duty, and in the end, he lost himself. That is why what makes Davy Jones unforgettable is not only the way he looks. What truly makes him powerful is why he became this way. Because some characters are evil from the beginning. Others are transformed under the weight of what they have endured. Davy Jones belonged to the second kind, and perhaps that is why, despite becoming one of the most feared names of the seas, he is also remembered as one of its most tragic figures.